Hi guys. So we're going to continue talking about files. We're going to look at some. Today we're going to look at a function that is really useful for dealing with files and strings in general. We've talked about some of these things a bit. Um, so in most cases, when you want to write things out to a file, there are things that are referenced by variables. So a lot of times it's necessary for us to concatenate a /n to the data before we write it. Remember, concatenate means to add something to the end of a string, right? So we can use the plus operator. We've already talked about strings and how to concatenate things, but we can use the plus operator in the argument of the write method. So on the other hand, a lot of times when we On the other hand, a lot of times when we read things in from a file, remember if we use readline, the /n will be in the file or in the string that we read in. So that's why in the original video, if you looked at the last example that we did from the last video, you'll see that there's actually an extra blank space in here. That's because if you remember, print puts a new line at the end of everything that you print. And there was already a new line at the end of this thing because there was a new line in it when we read it in using readline. So there were two new lines, and that's why we have the extra blank space in there, because there was one on the string already, which when we printed out, it got printed out, it went down to the bottom, and then print itself will add a new line automatically. And that's why there's a double new line here. There's actually a double new line in the other one too. We just can't see it. So if we want to remove things, we can use the string method rstrip, which you've already talked about before. You guys have done strings. You should know the rstrip method already. We talked about rstrip. It removes characters from the right-hand side of the string. In this case, we're going to remove all the /n's. I'm not going to go through that because we've already looked at how to do that. You should know how to do that from the strings chapter. All right. So again, we talked about this before, but when you open a file in W mode, if the file already exists, it's overwritten. So if you want to append data to the file, we use the A mode. So then if the file exists, it's not erased, and if it doesn't exist, it's created. So data, when you write with the A mode, it's written to the end of the current contents of the file. So it's written to the end of the file. So numeric data, before you write them to the file, if you want to write them in text format, remember when we read them in from input, they're strings, we have to convert them to ints. If we want to go the other way, we need to convert them from ints to strings. So numbers, we're going to read them in, again, just like an input. When you read it in from the file, it's going to be as a string. We're going to need to convert to a numeric type, just like we did before with float and int, if we want to read or write these things from the files. So let's go up here and let's get rid of some of this stuff. Let's change this to write mode. And let's say we want to write some numbers. File1.write. And let's say we just put the number. So if you look at write, it takes a string. You can see here, it takes a string as a parameter. If I try to put 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to give me an error, right? Maybe not an error, but it says it was expecting a string. It got an int instead. Let's see what happens when we run this. So we got an error, and it says argument must be str, which is string, not int. And so what we need to do to convert this to a string, is we need to use the string function. This will convert it to a string. And now when we go to our file and we look in it, it's got the number 1, 2, 3 in it. All right. So now that it's got the number 1, 2, 3 in it, let's look at reading from the same file. So now we're going to call read, and when we call read, let's say, the file contents, we know it's 1, 2, 3, right? So let's just say we want to print file contents plus 1. So this is something that we should expect to be able to do, right? 1, 2, 3, so it should print 1, 2, 3, 4. So what happens when we run this? We see that we get an error. Can only concatenate string to string, not int. And so what's happening is, remember, this thing is going to be a string. What we're going to read in is going to be the string 1, 2, 3. And so this plus is not addition. Remember, if it's a string argument, this is going to be concatenation. We can't concatenate a string and an int, so we could put strings around here. This is not going to give us 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to give us 1, 2, 3, 1, because remember, when you concatenate with the plus operator strings, it's going to add it to the end. It doesn't do arithmetic. So if we want to add something to this thing, what we have to do is we have to do the same thing we did with input, right? We have to first convert the string to an int. Convert the string to an int, 1, 2, 3, 4, and there we go. So with the stuff that we read in from the files, even if it looks like an integer, is not an integer, it's a string. Just like when we used input, we have to convert from a string to an int, and when we want to write out, we have to convert from an int to a string. Okay, remember to keep these things straight. It can be a little confusing, especially when you first start reading. You look at the file and you go, wow, that's a number. Why is it not a number? Why can't I add to it? It's not a number. It's a string, just like input, exactly the same. It's a string, not a number, and you need to do the conversion. Okay.